Inspector Walters, a man of methodical habit and limited imagination, stood before the Burano lace cloth with the expression of one confronting a crossword puzzle written in a language he did not quite speak. He was 53 years old, with the sort of face that had been handsome in youth and had aged into a kind of weathered reliability that inspired confidence without generating particular enthusiasm. His notebook lay open in his hand, though he had written very little, as though waiting for the mystery to arrange itself into a form that his pen might adequately capture. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the tea service, ostensibly engaged in mild conversation with Margaret Whitley about the difficulties of sourcing good Belgian linen, watched the inspector with the particular attention she reserved for men whose competence was limited primarily by the narrowness of their assumptions. He had already, she noted, made his first significant error. He had asked Mrs. Ashford directly whether she recognized the handwriting, as though the perpetrator of such a message would be foolish enough to admit recognition, and when Mrs. Ashford had, with admirable control, denied any knowledge of its origin, he had seemed satisfied in a way that suggested he believed her protestation to be authentic rather than merely convincing. The drawing-room had been sealed, pending a more thorough examination, though it was difficult to imagine what forensic methodology might extract meaning from an inscription worked into 17th-century lace by an unknown hand at an unknown time. The guests, released from their informal detention with instructions not to discuss the matter beyond the village, had gradually departed into the grey afternoon, each departure accompanied by the sort of speculative glance that suggested they would do precisely the opposite of what they had been instructed. Mrs. Ashford had retreated to her bedroom, claiming a migraine of such severity that she would be unable to receive visitors, a claim that was accepted without comment but believed by no one. David Pritchard, who had lingered longer than propriety strictly dictated, seemed particularly disturbed by this development. Hovering near the study door with the restless energy of a man prevented from action, he deems necessary. Miss Marple, excusing herself from Margaret Whitley's increasingly insistent conversation about the dubious quality of modern needlework, made her way through the corridors of Thornfield Manor with the deliberate aimlessness that masked her genuine purpose. She had, over many years, developed a facility for moving through other people's homes in a manner that seemed accidental rather than intentional, an ability that arose partly from genuine absent-mindedness and partly from a profound understanding that most people see what they expect to see rather than what is actually before them. The house itself was instructive, she reflected, as she drifted past the study where David Pritchard was now engaged in low conversation with Inspector Walters. The furnishings spoke of genuine wealth, but also of a certain aesthetic uncertainty, as though Mrs. Ashford had assembled her surroundings according to some external standard of what a woman of her position should possess, rather than according to any personal vision. The artwork, though respectable, seemed chosen by someone consulting a guidebook rather than listening to instinct. It was only when one examined the small space, the arrangement of personal effects on a writing desk, the selection of volumes on a particular shelf, the photographs displayed with careful casualness, that one began to perceive the actual woman beneath the constructed identity. In Mrs. Ashford's study, Miss Marple noted several significant details that would have been invisible to a more cursory observer. There was, first, a correspondence file containing letters from solicitors regarding property transfers. Second, a collection of theatrical programs from London, dating back some 15 years, carefully preserved and arranged chronologically. And third, most intriguingly, a small oil painting, not hung but leaning against the inside of a cupboard as though someone had chosen to hide it rather than display it. The painting depicted a young woman, perhaps 25, with a startling resemblance to Thomas Ashford, though rendered in a style and with an intimacy that suggested a relationship far closer than siblinghood. Miss Marple replaced everything with meticulous care, disturbing nothing in a way that would register as disturbance, and continued her gentle perambulation through the house. By the time she had completed her examination, The evening had begun its descent into proper darkness, and Inspector Walters was preparing to depart, having apparently concluded that no immediate progress could be made on a matter that seemed, on its surface, to be nothing more than an elaborate prank. He had made arrangements to return the following morning, armed with a photographer and a specialist in documents, neither of whom would, Miss Marple suspected, discover anything of significance. As she allowed herself to be driven back to her cottage by the ever-reliable Dolly Bantam, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear at precisely the moment when transportation was required, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious fact that Mrs. Ashford's terror, when confronted with the inscription, had seemed not the shock of genuine surprise, but rather the awful recognition of something long feared finally made manifest. There was also, she reflected with the sort of quiet certainty that rarely led her astray, the matter of Thomas Ashford's reaction, or rather the studied absence of reaction that had characterized his deportment throughout the afternoon's disturbance. Most people, when confronted with mysterious inscriptions and evident distress in their family members, displayed some form of concern or curiosity. Thomas Ashford had merely withdrawn further into himself, like a creature sensing danger and preparing to become invisible. As her cottage came into view, that familiar structure of stone and roses that had sheltered her for nearly 40 years, Miss Marple allowed herself the luxury of considering what she had observed and what it might suggest about the deeper currents running beneath Thornfield's placid surface. The inscription on the lace, crude though it was, had been written with deliberation, with knowledge, and with purpose. Someone in the village had placed it there with the specific intention of conveying a message to Mrs. Ashford, and that someone possessed information of such consequence that its revelation seemed worth the considerable risk of such an action. The question, as Miss Marple saw it, was not who had written the message, but rather what truth that message was meant to unearth. The morning following the discovery of the inscription brought with it a peculiar quality of anticipation that seemed to permeate the village of Thornfield like moisture in the air before rain. Miss Marple, rising at her customary hour of 6 o'clock, found herself contemplating the matter over her modest breakfast of toast and marmalade with the sort of sustained attention that others might reserve for matters of genuine consequence, though she had long since learned that human nature rarely distinguished between the trivial and the profound in the manner that logic might suggest it should. The Morning Post, delivered by young Timothy Garrett with his customary lack of discretion, contained not only the expected bills and circulars, but also, most unusually, a letter addressed to Miss Marple in a hand she did not immediately recognize. The envelope bore no return address, and the postmark indicated it had been mailed from the village post office the previous evening, which suggested that someone had taken considerable care to ensure its prompt delivery. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate precision and opened the envelope to reveal a single sheet of paper containing a message written in the same careful copperplate hand that had appeared on the Burano lace cloth. The message read simply, "You noticed what others did not. Please call upon me this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Come alone. The matter concerns Mrs. Ashford and a truth that cannot remain hidden." There was no signature, no indication of identity, yet the tone suggested someone of education and desperation in roughly equal measure. Miss Marple's first instinct was to take the letter directly to Inspector Walters, but her second instinct, the one that had, over many years, proven more reliable, suggested that doing so would serve primarily to alarm an already anxious woman and to alert the authorities to a development that might prove more illuminating if pursued with greater subtlety. She therefore placed the letter in her knitting bag and proceeded with her day as though nothing of particular moment had occurred, though she did, around mid-morning, take the liberty of telephoning Constance Hartwell, ostensibly to inquire about a particularly interesting yarn for a charitable project, but actually to ascertain whether her sharp-eyed neighbor had observed anything unusual in the village during the preceding evening. Constance, delighted as always by the prospect of dispensing information, reported that Thomas Ashford had been seen walking alone toward the woods beyond the manor house at approximately 7 o'clock, returning nearly an hour later with muddy shoes and what appeared to be genuine distress etched into his features. She had also observed, with the sort of precision that suggested she had been actively monitoring the manor, that David Pritchard's motor car remained parked outside for considerably longer than a social visit would typically require, and that when he had finally emerged, he had worn the expression of a man who had received information both shocking and significant. This intelligence, while interesting, did not immediately clarify matters, though it suggested that the circle of those who possessed knowledge of whatever secret lay beneath the surface was considerably larger than might have been apparent from the previous day's events. Miss Marple spent the early afternoon in her garden, attending to the autumn tidying that occupied much of her time during this season, though her hands moved through the familiar motions while her mind occupied itself with the patterns emerging from the accumulated observations of the previous 24 hours. At 2:30, she set out on foot toward a destination she had not yet firmly determined, carrying with her a pair of gardening gloves and an expression of benign purposefulness that suggested she was merely taking her constitutional walk and might happen, through the accident of circumstance, to wander toward any number of locations. The afternoon was gray and cool, with that particular quality of dampness that suggested rain within the hour, and the village streets held that peculiar emptiness that characterized weekday afternoons when most people were engaged in the ordinary business of living and therefore unlikely to notice the passage of an elderly woman absorbed in her own thoughts. As Miss Marple approached the vicarage, it occurred to her that the mysterious letter might originate from Margaret Whitley, the vicar's wife, whose position in the village granted her both access to gossip and a certain moral standing that might encourage her toward actions of righteous exposure. Yet, as she considered this possibility, she found it increasingly implausible, for Margaret's interventions in village affairs, while sometimes precipitous, were typically accompanied by considerable self-righteousness and a transparent desire for acknowledgement of her role in any resolution. This letter bore none of those characteristics. It suggested, rather, someone acting from compulsion rather than principle, from fear rather than righteousness. At precisely 3 o'clock, Miss Marple found herself standing before the gate of a small cottage at the far end of the village, a property that had belonged for the past 6 months to a woman named Eleanor Price, who had moved to Thornfield following some vague personal misfortune and had maintained a quiet, retiring existence that had generated exactly the sort of curious speculation that such retirement inevitably produces in small communities. Miss Marple, pushing open the gate with a slight creak of hinges, proceeded up the pathway toward a door painted a faded blue, aware that she was approaching a moment that would either clarify the emerging mystery or deepen it into further obscurity. It was at this juncture, as she raised her hand to knock upon the door, that she became aware of movement in her peripheral vision, a figure emerging from between the cottages with the urgency of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. It was Thomas Ashford, his face marked by an expression of such desperate resolve that Miss Marple immediately recognized the particular expression of a man who had committed himself to an action that he both feared and felt compelled to complete. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the ragged quality of genuine anguish, "I must speak with you. What you are about to learn will change everything you have believed about my sister, about this village, about the very nature of what we consider respectable." Miss Marple lowered her hand from the cottage door with a deliberateness that suggested she had merely been about to knock rather than already committed to a course of action, and turned to face Thomas Ashford with an expression of gentle inquiry that gave nothing away of her internal assessment of this unexpected interruption. The young man was, she noted with the clinical precision that decades of observation had honed into habit, in a state of considerable emotional agitation, though he was making a visible effort to contain that agitation behind the facade of social composure, an effort that was only partially successful. His hands, thrust into his jacket pockets, trembled slightly, and his eyes possessed that peculiar glassiness that suggested either recent tears or the desperate effort to prevent them. "Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying that particular quality of sympathetic neutrality that encouraged confession without demanding it. "I believe we should discuss this matter somewhere less exposed to the observation of passers-by. Perhaps we might return to my cottage? It is not far, and I find that conversations of importance benefit greatly from proper setting and the offering of tea." Thomas Ashford appeared to hesitate, glancing toward the cottage door as though wrestling with competing imperatives, but something in Miss Marple's calm demeanor seemed to settle the conflict within him, and he nodded with the gratitude of someone relieved to have the burden of decision temporarily removed from his shoulders. As they walked together through the graying afternoon, with the threatened rain now beginning to fall in tentative droplets, Miss Marple found herself observing the young man's comportment with the attention she normally reserved for particularly complex needlework. He walked with the gait of someone who had spent considerable time abroad, a certain looseness of limb that contrasted sharply with the rigid formality that characterized most of the village's male inhabitants. His clothing, while respectable, bore the marks of continental tailoring, and his accent, when he spoke, carried slight inflections that suggested his recent years had not been spent exclusively in England. By the time they reached her cottage, the rain had intensified from tentative suggestion to genuine downpour, and they entered with the relief of those who have narrowly avoided becoming thoroughly drenched. Miss Marple installed Thomas in her sitting room with the efficiency that long practice had perfected, providing him with tea, a small plate of biscuits, and the particular species of non-judgmental attention that seemed to create a vacuum into which troubled confessions naturally flowed. For several minutes, Thomas said nothing, merely held his teacup without drinking from it, his gaze fixed upon some point beyond the confines of the room. Finally, he set down the cup with deliberate care and began to speak, his voice low and carrying the quality of someone recounting events that had haunted him for years, and finally found expression intolerable to postpone any longer. "Eleanor Price," he said, and the name itself seemed to carry weight in the room, "is not who she presents herself to be. She is, in fact, my daughter, though no one in the village knows this, save my sister, my solicitor, and now, apparently, whoever wrote that message on the lace." Miss Marple, who had been knitting with her customary rhythm, allowed her needles to still fractionally, though she continued to attend to her work with undimmed focus. "That is, I suspect, a considerable secret in a village such as Thornfield, where genealogy is treated with the reverence usually reserved for scripture," she said mildly. "I presume the circumstances of Miss Price's birth are not such as would invite general approbation." Thomas Ashford laughed, a sound so devoid of genuine mirth that it seemed to fill the cottage with melancholy. "Miss Price's birth," he said, "occurred in Paris 15 years ago, during what my sister was pleased to describe as my youthful indiscretion abroad. The mother was a woman of considerable talent but no social standing whatsoever. A painter, which, combined with her French nationality and certain other unfortunate characteristics, made her entirely unsuitable in my sister's estimation for any relationship beyond a temporary one." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had taken on a harder quality, edged with resentment that had clearly accumulated over years of suppression. "I loved Eleanor's mother, Miss Marple. I wished to marry her, to provide for our child, to live a life that seemed to me vastly superior to the one my position in English society was demanding of me. But my sister, who controlled the family finances through means I will not detail, made it abundantly clear that such a course of action would result in my complete financial ruin and social ostracism. She offered me, instead, a compromise. I would maintain a modest allowance sufficient to support Eleanor and her mother abroad, provided I returned to England, married someone of suitable breeding, and never acknowledged my daughter publicly." The revelation hung in the cottage air like cigarette smoke, and Miss Marple found herself reconsidering a number of observations she had made regarding Mrs. Ashford's comportment and the peculiar tension that seemed to characterize her relationship with her brother. "Your sister," Miss Marple said carefully, "maintained this arrangement for 15 years. Thomas Ashford nodded grimly. "Until Eleanor's mother died 2 years ago. Eleanor was left alone, and I could not bear it. I used some modest inheritances from our mother to establish Eleanor here, ostensibly as a distant relative, though I suspect very few in the village have believed that fiction. Vivienne was furious when she discovered Eleanor's presence in the village, but by that time I was of age and in possession of property she could not control. Our relationship, already strained by years of bitterness, became virtually non-existent." He looked directly at Miss Marple for the first time since beginning his recitation. "I did not write that inscription, Miss Marple, but I fear Eleanor may have. She has a right to anger, a right to make my sister acknowledge the life that has been denied her. But such acknowledgement would destroy Vivienne, and despite everything, I cannot wish that upon my sister." Miss Marple continued her knitting with undiminished focus, though her needles moved with a slightly altered rhythm that suggested her mind was engaged in processes more complex than the mechanical repetition of stitches. The rain continued its percussion against the cottage windows, creating an almost hypnotic accompaniment to the confession that had begun to unfold within her sitting room. When she spoke, her voice retained its characteristic gentleness, yet it carried within it the subtle weight of someone who had, through decades of observation, learned to distinguish between truth and the particular species of falsehood that arises from incomplete confession. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you have told me a great deal, yet I suspect you have not told me everything. A man does not arrive at an elderly woman's cottage in a state of considerable agitation merely to explain the existence of a daughter he has been concealing. There is something further, something that connects Miss Price's possible authorship of the inscription to a more immediate concern." Thomas Ashford's hands, which had begun to relax slightly during the recitation of his history, tensed once more, and he rose from his chair to move toward the window, where he stood gazing out at the rain-obscured street beyond. "There is another matter," he said after a prolonged silence. "Something that occurred approximately 1 week ago, something that Eleanor confided to me in a moment of genuine distress. She discovered, quite by accident, that my sister has been engaged in a rather elaborate scheme of financial deception regarding the estate. There are properties that should have been entailed to me but which my sister has been systematically selling, converting the proceeds into investments held in borrowed names, all with the apparent intention of leaving me substantially diminished in fortune while maintaining the appearance of family wealth." He turned back to face Miss Marple, and his expression had shifted into something harder, more resolved. "Eleanor discovered documents in my sister's study while she was taking tea there. Yes, they have begun a cautious reconciliation of sorts, and she brought them to me. The deception is extensive, Miss Marple, and it is criminal in nature. My sister has essentially been embezzling from the family trust for nearly a decade." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her movements suggesting she had reached a decision of some significance. "And you believe," she said, "that the inscription upon the lace cloth is Eleanor's manner of forcing your sister to acknowledge this deception, either to you or to the authorities?" Thomas shook his head vehemently. "I do not know what Eleanor believes or intends, Miss Marple. That is precisely why I have come to you. Eleanor is capable of great passion, but also of great recklessness. I fear that she may have written the inscription as a threat, a means of compelling my sister toward confession, but I also fear that my sister, confronted with exposure, might take actions far more drastic than mere confession." The implications of this statement hung between them like the proverbial sword, and Miss Marple found herself considering a possibility that, while it had not previously occurred to her, now seemed to possess a certain terrible logic. She had, over the course of the previous evening, been assuming that the inscription represented a threat or exposure of some historical transgression, something belonging to the past that had been dredged up for purposes of blackmail or righteousness. It had not occurred to her that it might represent something more immediate, a warning of present deception about to be revealed, or worse, an implicit threat that someone possessed dangerous knowledge. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, her voice now carrying an undertone of urgency that was unusual. For her, has Miss Price conveyed any indication of her intentions beyond the writing of this inscription? Has she threatened to expose these financial irregularities to you directly, or has she suggested that she might bring the matter to the attention of the authorities? Thomas Ashford's silence was more eloquent than any words could have been, and Miss Marple felt the particular chill that comes with the recognition of genuine danger. She said, he finally articulated, that she intended to give my sister 1 week to come forward voluntarily with a confession, and that if Vivian refused to do so, Eleanor would ensure that the matter became public. She said it was a matter of justice, that a wrong that had been concealed for so long deserved to be brought into the light regardless of the consequences. I counseled caution. I suggested that there might be ways to address the matter that did not involve public scandal. But Eleanor was adamant, Miss Marple. She said that Vivian had stolen her mother's life through financial manipulation and isolation, and that she would not allow her to continue profiting from criminality. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone considerably older than her years, and she made her way to the mantelpiece where a small clock indicated that the afternoon was advancing rapidly toward evening. "When precisely did Miss Price make this declaration?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of something approaching command. "4 days ago," Thomas replied, "which means that the deadline Miss Price established would expire approximately 3 days hence. Miss Marple, I'm terrified that my sister will either attempt to destroy the evidence before Eleanor can bring it to light, or worse, that she will attempt something even more desperate in response to the threat of exposure." Miss Marple turned from the mantelpiece, and in the fading afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, her expression had taken on a quality of such focused intensity that Thomas Ashford seemed to shrink beneath the weight of her gaze. "You must tell me," she said, "whether your sister has been alone during the past 4 days, and whether she has made any unusual movements regarding property, finances, or persons of authority. Furthermore, I require a complete accounting of everyone who has had access to the Burano lace cloth before the exhibition, and I wish to know with precision when exactly the inscription was first noticed by your sister." Thomas Ashford provided the information that Miss Marple requested with the precision of a man who had, over the previous days, engaged in considerable scrutiny of his sister's movements and comportment, though his account was necessarily incomplete, filtered through observation rather than direct knowledge. According to his testimony, Mrs. Ashford had indeed been alone for substantial portions of the preceding 4 days, ostensibly engaged in preparations for the exhibition, though he had observed her making several telephone calls of apparent significance and receiving at least 2 visitors, David Pritchard on one occasion and, more surprisingly, Constance Hartwell on another. The Burano lace cloth had arrived at Thornfield Manor 5 days prior, delivered by courier from an auction house in London, and Mrs. Ashford had examined it privately before displaying it to anyone else. Thomas could not say with certainty when the inscription had been added, though the most logical conclusion suggested it had been written sometime between the cloth's arrival and the moment of its public revelation at the exhibition. Miss Marple listened to this account with the particular attention of one extracting meaning from interstices as much as from explicit statement, and she found herself constructing a timeline that suggested possibilities ranging from the merely complicated to the genuinely sinister. After Thomas had provided his information, she served him a light supper, cold chicken, fresh bread, and a modest wine, and then, with the sort of kindly firmness that brooked no argument, she installed him in her guest bedroom with instructions that he was to remain there for the evening, as she had matters to attend to that required his temporary absence from the village's observation. Once Thomas had been settled, Miss Marple engaged in a course of action that would have seemed, to any observer, to be nothing more than an elderly woman preparing for bed in her usual manner. She changed into her nightgown, set out her morning tea things, and arranged her bedroom in the orderly fashion that characterized her domestic habits. However, she also, with movements that suggested long practice in covert operation, extracted from a locked drawer a leather-bound journal in which she had, over the past 30 years, maintained detailed records of village genealogies, personal histories, and the interconnected web of relationships and secrets that constituted the true architecture of Thornfield society. She lit her bedside lamp and, settling herself into her reading chair with a cup of cocoa, she began to turn through the pages with deliberate purpose, searching for connections that her conscious mind had perhaps not fully articulated, but her intuition had recognized as significant. What she found, after perhaps half an hour of methodical examination, caused her to set down her cocoa with a precision that suggested the importance of what she had discovered. In her journal, dating back some 18 years, she had made note of a peculiar scandal involving David Pritchard's late wife, Caroline, who had apparently maintained a friendship with a French woman of uncertain reputation during a continental holiday. The entry, made in Miss Marple's characteristic neat handwriting, noted that Caroline Pritchard had returned from this holiday somewhat changed in demeanor, and that David Pritchard, while remaining outwardly devoted, had subsequently begun spending considerably more time away from home on what he described as legal business. The connection, once perceived, seemed almost obvious in its implications, and Miss Marple found herself reconsidering the young woman who now resided in the cottage at the edge of Thornfield with an understanding that was considerably expanded by this historical context. Eleanor Price, who had been born in Paris 15 years ago, would have been born approximately 1 year after the Pritchards' continental holiday. Caroline Pritchard had died in childbirth some 14 years prior, a fact that Miss Marple's journal confirmed with clinical notation. Eleanor's mother, as described by Thomas, had been a painter of continental extraction. The possibilities suggested by these intersecting facts were numerous and profound in their implications. Miss Marple rose from her reading chair and made her way downstairs to her small study, where she kept a more comprehensive collection of correspondence, including letters exchanged with various acquaintances over the years. After a search that occupied nearly an hour, she located a letter from an old friend in Paris, dated approximately 16 years prior, containing gossip about English visitors to the continental art scene. The letter mentioned in passing that a particularly talented English woman had become quite close to a French artist of some promise, and that there had been whispers about an improper attachment. The English woman's name, obliquely referenced, could have belonged to Caroline Pritchard, though the letter stopped short of explicit confirmation. Miss Marple returned to her study chair and sat in the growing awareness that what had seemed a relatively straightforward matter of family scandal and financial deception had become considerably more complex. If Eleanor Price was indeed the daughter of both Thomas Ashford and Caroline Pritchard, an impossibility that the evidence nonetheless suggested, then the entire structure of relationships within Thornfield took on a new and more sinister configuration. Mrs. Ashford would not merely be concealing her brother's illegitimate daughter, but would be protecting the reputations of both her brother and the family of her closest neighbor. Moreover, David Pritchard, who had apparently known of Eleanor's existence and her presence in the village without comment, occupied a position of extraordinary influence over Mrs. Ashford's actions and decisions. The implications of this configuration became increasingly apparent as Miss Marple contemplated the matter further. If David Pritchard had encouraged Eleanor's residence in Thornfield, if he had perhaps even facilitated her discovery of the financial deceptions in Mrs. Ashford's management of the estate, then the inscription on the lace cloth took on a meaning far more calculated and purposeful than simple filial revenge. It began to appear, in fact, as though the entire sequence of events might represent a coordinated effort to expose Mrs. Ashford to circumstances that would make her vulnerable to pressure, blackmail, or worse. Miss Marple found herself considering whether Eleanor Price was truly the author of the inscription, or whether she was merely the instrument through which someone else's designs were being advanced. By the time the rain had ceased and the evening had deepened into genuine night, Miss Marple had concluded that she required additional information of a more direct nature, and that such information could only be obtained through a careful and calculated course of action that would risk much while revealing whether her suspicions possessed merit or represented merely the speculation of an overactive imagination applied to circumstantial evidence. The following morning arrived with that peculiar quality of clarity that sometimes follows storms, the sky having been swept clean of clouds and the village emerging into sunlight with the renewed appearance of something newly created. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour, and after attending to her morning toilette with meticulous care, she prepared a substantial breakfast for Thomas Ashford, whom she found already awake and pacing the small study with the restless energy of a man whose mind had been engaged in troubled contemplation throughout the night. She urged him to eat, and while he consumed the food with mechanical obedience rather than genuine appetite, she outlined for him a course of action that would, she explained, require considerable courage and absolute discretion. Thomas was to return to his residence at Thornfield Manor and conduct himself with perfect normalcy, allowing no indication that he had confided in anyone regarding Eleanor's ultimatum or the financial deceptions underlying it. Furthermore, he was to observe his sister's demeanor with particular attention to any indication that she intended to take action regarding the documents Eleanor had discovered, and he was to report to Miss Marple any significant development, no matter how seemingly minor. Thomas accepted these instructions with the gratitude of someone relieved to have the burden of solitary knowledge distributed among more capable hands, and he departed the cottage at approximately 8 o'clock with the appearance of a man who had spent the evening engaged in innocent repose. Miss Marple, having seen him off, spent the next several hours engaged in what appeared to be gardening, but was in fact a carefully orchestrated series of encounters with various village inhabitants. She called upon Margaret Whitley at the vicarage, ostensibly to solicit her assistance with a charitable project, but actually to ascertain whether the vicar's wife had observed anything unusual regarding David Pritchard's recent movements or demeanor. Margaret, delighted as always by the prospect of dispensing information, revealed that David had been remarkably distracted at recent social gatherings and that he had been seen making frequent visits to Thornfield Manor at hours that seemed somewhat unconventional for ordinary legal business. She had also, Margaret confided with the particular pleasure of one sharing genuine scandal, observed him in conversation with Eleanor Price on at least 2 occasions, an association that seemed rather unusual, given that Eleanor was ostensibly a distant relative of modest circumstance whom David would have had little reason to cultivate. This intelligence, while confirming certain of Miss Marple's suspicions, simultaneously raised new questions regarding the precise nature of the relationship between David Pritchard and Eleanor Price. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged, through a series of telephone calls that appeared casual, but were in fact meticulously orchestrated, to visit Eleanor Price's cottage ostensibly to deliver some surplus seedlings and to extend neighborly concern regarding Eleanor's apparent isolation in the village. Eleanor, when she opened the door, presented a young woman of considerable intelligence and beauty, with features that bore a striking resemblance to Thomas Ashford and, now that Miss Marple was attending to such matters, to the long-deceased Caroline Pritchard as well. The cottage interior revealed the aesthetic sensibilities of an artist. Canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls, and the furnishings, while modest, had been arranged with an eye toward both comfort and beauty. Eleanor welcomed Miss Marple with courtesy that suggested she understood perfectly well that the visit represented something other than simple neighborly solicitude, though she made no comment upon this understanding. Miss Marple, settling herself into a chair offered for her occupation, began a conversation that appeared to concern the difficulties of establishing oneself in a new community while actually directing its course toward observation of Eleanor's responses to various carefully constructed inquiries. She spoke of the complexities of family relationships, the manner in which hidden truths often caused greater damage through concealment than through revelation, and the dangers inherent in courses of action that seemed justified by righteousness but might result in unintended consequences of considerable magnitude. Eleanor listened to these philosophical musings with the patient attention of one who recognized that an elderly woman was employing indirection to communicate something of genuine import. And it was only when Miss Marple made a specific reference to the inscription on the Burano lace cloth that Eleanor's carefully maintained composure revealed cracks of genuine emotion. "You know," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the quality of someone no longer willing to maintain pretense, "that I did not write that inscription, Miss Marple. I have considered doing so on numerous occasions, have rehearsed in my mind the precise words that might compel my aunt to acknowledge the ire injustices inflicted upon my family, but I have not acted upon those impulses. My father counseled patience, and I have endeavored to honor that counsel despite the anger that consumes me when I contemplate how my mother was treated, how my existence has been treated as something shameful rather than as the result of genuine love." Miss Marple absorbed this declaration with a particular attention that the confession of truth always warranted, and she found herself revising her theories once more in light of this direct testimony. If Eleanor had not written the inscription, then the question of authorship became considerably more pressing, and the implications of that unknown authorship shifted the entire structure of the mystery into new and more ominous configurations. "Miss Price," Miss Marple said with careful precision, "I find myself obliged to ask you a question of considerable delicacy. Has Mr. David Pritchard made any communication to you regarding the inscription, or regarding his knowledge of your family circumstances? Has he, in any manner, encouraged you toward courses of action that might expose your aunt's financial irregularities?" Eleanor's response, a visible stiffening of her posture and a sudden inability to maintain eye contact, provided Miss Marple with the confirmation she required, though the full implications of that confirmation remained to be explored. Eleanor Price's silence extended for a duration that seemed to fill the small cottage with an almost palpable tension, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the quality of someone surrendering to the inevitable rather than offering voluntary confession. She described how David Pritchard had, some 3 months prior, approached her with the revelation that he was aware of her true parentage and her relationship to both Thomas Ashford and, most significantly, to his late wife Caroline. He had informed her that he possessed considerable sympathy for her situation, that he believed justice demanded the exposure of the wrongs that had been inflicted upon her and her mother through Mrs. Ashford's financial manipulation and social cruelty. David had suggested that the discovery of Mrs. Ashford's embezzlement represented an opportunity to compel her toward acknowledgement and restitution, and he had offered to assist Eleanor in locating the documents that would prove such embezzlement. Eleanor, consumed by the anger and resentment that decades of concealment had accumulated, had accepted his offer and had indeed discovered the financial records in Mrs. Ashford's study with David's guidance and encouragement. However, Eleanor confessed the relationship between herself and David had become considerably more complicated than a simple matter of shared purpose. David had begun to suggest that exposure of Mrs. Ashford's financial crimes might result in legal consequences that could lead to her prosecution, and that such prosecution might necessitate the liquidation of assets and the distribution of the estate according to legal precedent rather than according to Mrs. Ashford's wishes. He had also, Eleanor revealed with evident discomfort, begun to suggest that Eleanor's circumstances might be considerably improved through certain legal arrangements that would recognize her as a legitimate heir to the Ashford estate, arrangements that David, as a solicitor, would be uniquely positioned to facilitate. Miss Marple absorbed this confession with the recognition that what had appeared to be a relatively simple matter of family scandal had evolved into something considerably more calculated and predatory. David Pritchard was employing Eleanor as an instrument through which to destroy Mrs. Ashford's financial position and, by extension, to position himself as the executor of a considerable estate undergoing legal distribution. The inscription on the lace cloth, therefore, represented not Eleanor's action, but rather David's, a deliberate threat designed to drive Mrs. Ashford toward panic and potentially toward actions that would constitute additional crimes or would expose her to blackmail. "Miss Price," Miss Marple said with the particular firmness that signaled she was about to convey information of considerable consequence, "I must ask you directly whether Mr. Pritchard has suggested any specific actions that Mrs. Ashford should take in response to the discovery of her financial irregularities. Has he, for instance, recommended that she attempt to conceal evidence, or has he suggested courses of action that might place her in legal jeopardy?" Eleanor's response was hesitant, fragmented, and deeply troubling. David had indeed suggested that Mrs. Ashford might attempt to dispose of the incriminating documents, and he had implied that if she did so, his role as solicitor would place him in a position to ensure that her actions were documented and reported to the authorities. He had also suggested that Mrs. Ashford might attempt to flee the country, and that if she did so, her abandonment of family and community would constitute additional evidence of guilt that would prejudice any potential legal proceeding. More disturbingly, he had mentioned, in what Eleanor described as an almost casual manner, that sometimes individuals facing such circumstances became desperate enough to consider actions of extreme nature, and that he would not be surprised if Mrs. Ashford attempted something irreversible to escape her circumstances. Miss Marple felt the particular chill that comes with the recognition of genuine danger, and she rose from her chair with the abruptness of someone who has perceived that immediate action is required. She extracted from Eleanor a complete accounting of the documents David had discovered and the precise locations in which they were maintained. And she further extracted a promise that Eleanor would communicate immediately to her father the substance of her conversation with Miss Marple. She then departed the cottage with sufficient haste to suggest genuine urgency, though she maintained the external appearance of an elderly woman simply concluding an afternoon social call. Upon arriving at her own residence, Miss Marple placed a telephone call to Inspector Walters at the village police station, and she requested, in a manner that suggested she possessed information of considerable importance, that he call upon her immediately and come prepared to hear a matter of genuine urgency. While awaiting his arrival, she composed a detailed written account of her observations, deductions, and suspicions, organizing them in the manner that she had learned over many years would present the clearest possible picture to authorities whose training had not prepared them for the recognition of psychological manipulation and calculated deception. Inspector Walters arrived within 20 minutes, his expression suggesting skepticism about whatever matter could be of such urgency as to justify an afternoon summons from an elderly woman. That skepticism rapidly transformed into something approaching alarm as Miss Marple methodically outlined her theory, that David Pritchard had deliberately constructed a scenario designed to expose Mrs. Ashford to criminal liability, financial ruin, and psychological desperation, with the ultimate objective of positioning himself to benefit substantially from her downfall. She explained the connection between Eleanor and Caroline Pritchard, the manner in which David had exploited Eleanor's legitimate grievances to serve his own purposes, and the specific warnings he had made regarding Mrs. Ashford's potential desperation. Most critically, she expressed her concern that Mrs. Ashford, confronted with the knowledge that her crimes were about to be exposed, and believing that her only remaining options were legal prosecution or flight, might take action of an irreversible nature. Inspector Walters, recognizing the validity of these concerns despite their foundation in psychological insight rather than forensic evidence, agreed that Mrs. Ashford's immediate safety should be ascertained and that David Pritchard should be questioned regarding his recent communications and activities. The journey to Thornfield Manor, undertaken by Miss Marple and Inspector Walters in the inspector's official motor car, was conducted in a silence that suggested both men, though Miss Marple was technically a woman, were engaged in the process of considering the implications of what had been theorized and what might be discovered upon arrival. The afternoon light was beginning its inevitable descent toward evening when they reached the manor's gates, and the estate presented that particular appearance of settled domesticity that characterized English country houses at the hour of early dusk. Inspector Walters, upon entering the house through the front entrance, was informed by the household staff that Mrs. Ashford had not emerged from her study since mid-afternoon and had specifically instructed that she was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. This information, delivered with the sort of casual observation that servants typically employ, struck both Miss Marple and the inspector with the weight of genuine concern, and they proceeded directly to the study door, which they found to be locked from the interior. Inspector Walters' attempts to gain entry through polite request were met with no response, and it was only when he made clear his intention to break down the door that a muffled voice from within invited them to wait while she attended to certain matters. The delay that followed seemed to extend interminably, though it likely encompassed only a few minutes, and when the door finally opened, it revealed Mrs. Ashford in a state that was considerably more composed than her circumstances would seem to warrant. She stood in the doorway, wearing an expression of profound exhaustion, but also of something approaching resignation, as though she had reached some conclusion regarding her situation that permitted her to acknowledge its reality without the necessity of further denial or evasion. Behind her, visible through the open study door, Inspector Walters could observe the scattered papers and correspondence that constituted the evidence of her financial deceptions, arranged as though she had been in the process of organizing them for presentation rather than concealment. "Inspector Walters," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice carrying the peculiar flatness of someone who had moved beyond fear into a kind of detached acceptance. "I believe you have come regarding matters that I have been expecting, though not precisely in the manner I anticipated. Please, come into my study. I've prepared a complete accounting of my financial transactions over the past decade, and I'm prepared to offer whatever cooperation I can provide toward the clarification of these matters." Inspector Walters exchanged a glance with Miss Marple that conveyed his uncertainty regarding the significance of this unexpected cooperation, though Miss Marple's expression suggested that she had anticipated precisely this development. They entered the study to find Mrs. Ashford positioned behind her desk with the demeanor of someone conducting business rather than confessing to crimes, and she proceeded to offer a detailed and surprisingly comprehensive account of her financial manipulations, her motivations, and her intentions regarding the disposition of the embezzled funds. She explained that her actions had been motivated initially by a genuine concern regarding the management of the estate and a belief that she could better serve the family's long-term interests through careful and discreet investment of surplus capital. However, she acknowledged that this justification had gradually evolved into something more purely self-serving, and that over the years she had become increasingly aware that her actions constituted criminal deception and theft. What struck Miss Marple most profoundly during this recitation was not the substance of Mrs. Ashford's confession, but rather the absence of emotional content accompanying it. Mrs. Ashford spoke of her crimes with the clinical precision of someone discussing abstract legal principles rather than personal transgressions. There was no evidence of the desperation that Miss Marple had anticipated would characterize a woman driven toward confession by psychological pressure and fear of exposure. After perhaps 30 minutes of detailed explanation, during which Inspector Walters took extensive notes and Mrs. Ashford answered his questions with apparent honesty, Miss Marple interposed a question that seemed to redirect the conversation into unexpected territory. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying the quality of someone asking about trivial social matters rather than issues of genuine significance, "I find myself curious regarding your visit from Mr. David Pritchard yesterday evening. What was the substance of that conversation, and what specifically did he communicate regarding his knowledge of your financial circumstances?" Mrs. Ashford's carefully maintained composure underwent a subtle but unmistakable alteration at this question, and when she responded, her voice carried the first genuine emotion that had emerged during the entire proceeding. "Mr. Pritchard," she said slowly, "came to inform me that he possessed evidence of my financial irregularities and that he was prepared to report this evidence to the authorities unless I agreed to certain conditions regarding the disposition of my estate. Specifically, He requested that I execute a new will that would designate him as executor and would provide for the transfer of certain properties to Eleanor Price, or rather, to Eleanor Ashford, as he insisted upon designating her, with the implication that he would receive substantial compensation for facilitating these arrangements. The implications of this revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of confirmation, and she found herself considering the precise psychological mechanisms through which David Pritchard had constructed his scheme. He had not merely sought to expose Mrs. Ashford's financial crimes. He had deliberately constructed circumstances designed to place her in a position of such profound vulnerability that she would be forced to accept his terms and to provide him with legal authority over the disposition of her estate. Furthermore, in presenting his demands to Mrs. Ashford, he had placed her in the position of having to choose between voluntary compliance with his extortionate terms or confrontation with legal and social consequences that would be considerably more destructive. "Inspector Walters," Miss Marple said with a particular firmness that signaled she was about to convey information essential to the proper understanding of the matter, "I believe you will find, upon investigation, that Mr. Pritchard's knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's financial irregularities derives not from independent discovery, but from information deliberately provided by Eleanor Price, information that Mr. Pritchard encouraged her to seek with the specific intention of employing it as leverage against Mrs. Ashford. Moreover, I suspect that upon examination of Mr. Pritchard's own financial records, you will discover that he has been systematically representing clients in estate matters, and has exhibited a pattern of behavior whereby he has attempted to position himself in roles of authority and financial benefit regarding the disposition of considerable assets." Mrs. Ashford, hearing this analysis, closed her eyes as though the full weight of her situation had suddenly become apparent to her, and when she opened them again, there was evidence of tears that had not been present moments before. "I have been such a fool," she said quietly, "and in my foolishness I have brought this destruction upon myself." Inspector Walters, recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond the relatively straightforward matter of financial embezzlement into something considerably more complex and potentially more criminal, excused himself from the study to place telephone calls to his superiors and to arrange for a constable to remain at Thornfield Manor pending further investigation. Mrs. Ashford, left alone with Miss Marple, seemed to undergo a subtle transformation as the weight of official authority receded temporarily from the room, and she found herself regarding the elderly woman with an expression that combined gratitude, shame, and a desperate need for the sort of understanding that seemed to emanate from Miss Marple's quiet presence. "How did you perceive what others did not?" Mrs. Ashford asked, her voice carrying the quality of someone genuinely seeking comprehension rather than merely making conversation. Miss Marple, settling herself into a chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had earned the right to physical repose through decades of careful observation, offered an explanation that was characteristically humble in tone yet profound in its implications. She spoke of the manner in which human behavior, while infinitely varied in its specific manifestations, often followed patterns that repeated themselves across different contexts and different individuals. She explained that David Pritchard's approach to Mrs. Ashford bore striking similarity to behaviors she had observed in village life over many years. The predatory solicitude of someone who had identified a vulnerable target, the careful construction of circumstances designed to place that target in positions of increasing desperation, and the ultimate exploitation of desperation to extract compliance with demands that would otherwise be unthinkable. What distinguished Mr. Pritchard's actions from the ordinary varieties of human cruelty, Miss Marple explained, was the systematic nature of his approach and the deliberate manner in which he employed Eleanor Price as an instrument through which to accomplish his objectives. He recognized in Eleanor's genuine grievances the perfect mechanism through which to access you and to construct circumstances that would place you in positions of increasing vulnerability. However, he underestimated the degree to which Eleanor herself possessed a conscience, and he failed to anticipate that she might ultimately resist becoming a tool of his manipulation. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Inspector Walters, who bore the news that additional investigators would be arriving from the city within the hour to take over the matter from the village constabulary. He further indicated that David Pritchard had been located at his residence and was being brought in for questioning regarding the substance of his communications with Mrs. Ashford and Eleanor Price. Before departing with Mrs. Ashford to make a formal statement at the police station, Inspector Walters turned to Miss Marple with an expression of genuine gratitude and respect. "Miss Marple," he said with a formality that suggested he understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished, "I suspect that without your intervention, this matter would have concluded in a manner considerably more tragic than what we have witnessed." Mrs. Ashford's desperation, combined with Mr. Pritchard's deliberate manipulation, had created circumstances in which irreversible action seemed to her the only available course. "Your insights have prevented what might well have become a genuine tragedy." After Mrs. Ashford and Inspector Walters had departed, Miss Marple found herself alone in the study of Thornfield Manor, surrounded by the papers and correspondence that documented a decade of financial deception and personal betrayal. She spent some time examining these documents, not from any sense of morbid curiosity, but rather from the professional interest of someone seeking to understand the psychological architecture through which human beings justify their transgressions to themselves. What emerged from this examination was a portrait of a woman who had begun with justifiable financial concerns, but had gradually permitted those concerns to evolve into increasingly elaborate self-deceptions that ultimately resulted in criminal behavior. The tragedy of Mrs. Ashford's situation, as Miss Marple perceived it, was not that she had committed crimes, but that she had done so in the context of a life already constrained by family obligation, social expectation, and the particular burden of being a woman managing substantial property in a society that had not been designed to facilitate such management. Thomas Ashford arrived at Thornfield Manor approximately an hour after his sister's departure to make her formal statement, and his expression underwent a series of transformations as he gradually absorbed the substance of what had occurred. Miss Marple, with characteristic restraint, provided him with an account of the day's events that conveyed the essential facts while omitting the more destructive details that served no purpose save to deepen his anguish regarding his sister's situation. She explained that while Mrs. Ashford would face legal consequences for her financial crimes, those consequences would likely be mitigated by the evidence that she had been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation and extortion by David Pritchard, and that her confession, while prompted by threat, had been comprehensive and cooperative. More significantly, she indicated that Eleanor Price's own role in the matter appeared to have been that of an unwitting instrument who had ultimately recognized the exploitative nature of David Pritchard's manipulation and had cooperated with Miss Marple in exposing his scheme. Thomas received this information with the complex emotions of a man whose family had been subjected to considerable trauma, but whose fears regarding the ultimate outcomes had been partially ameliorated by the intervention of outside parties. He expressed profound gratitude to Miss Marple and indicated his intention to discuss with Eleanor the possibility of reconciliation with their family. A reconciliation that might be facilitated by the revelation that his sister's actions, while criminal, had been substantially motivated by concern for family interests rather than purely selfish impulse. By the time evening had fully descended upon Thornfield, and Miss Marple had returned to her cottage following a day of considerable emotional and intellectual exertion, she found herself reflecting upon the manner in which small communities contained within them the full spectrum of human behavior, from the profoundest kindness to the most calculated cruelty, and how the difference between tragedy and redemption often hinged upon the intervention of individuals who possessed the capacity to perceive patterns invisible to others and the courage to act upon those perceptions despite uncertainty and risk. The formal inquiry into the matter of David Pritchard's extortion and psychological manipulation proceeded over the subsequent 3 weeks with the thoroughness that major crimes warranted, and the investigation revealed details that, while substantiating Miss Marple's initial theories, also exposed a pattern of predatory behavior that extended considerably further back into Pritchard's professional history than anyone had previously suspected. Investigators discovered that he had engaged in similar schemes with at least 3 other clients over the past 15 years, employing various mechanisms of manipulation to position himself as executor of estates and to extract significant compensation for his services. Moreover, examination of his financial records revealed that he had accumulated considerable wealth through these extortionate arrangements, wealth that bore no relationship to his solicitor's salary, and that could only be explained through his systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Mrs. Ashford's case, while the most recent, proved to be merely the most sophisticated expression of a long-established pattern of criminal behavior. The legal proceedings that followed were characterized by the sort of complexity that typically accompanies cases involving both white-collar crime and the sort of psychological manipulation that blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator. Mrs. Ashford, having cooperated fully with investigators and having demonstrated genuine remorse for her financial crimes, received a sentence substantially mitigated by the circumstances of her victimization by Pritchard's extortion. She was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility, with the understanding that this sentence would be further reduced upon demonstration of rehabilitation and cooperation with ongoing investigations into Pritchard's broader criminal enterprise. David Pritchard, by contrast, faced charges not only of extortion and blackmail, but also of conspiracy and fraud, charges that carried considerably more severe penalties. His conviction resulted in a sentence of 7 years' imprisonment, with a strong indication from the presiding magistrate that he was fortunate to escape substantially harsher consequences given the calculated nature of his crimes and the vulnerability of his victims. Eleanor Price, whose position as a reluctant instrument of Pritchard's manipulation had been thoroughly documented during the investigation, was ultimately exonerated of any criminal responsibility, though the experience had left her considerably chastened regarding the dangers inherent in allowing legitimate grievances to overwhelm more careful judgment. In the weeks following these legal resolutions, Thornfield gradually returned to something approximating its customary rhythms, though the village bore the marks of having been forced to confront uncomfortable truths regarding the hidden complexity of lives that had appeared, on their surface, to be models of respectability and virtue. Thomas Ashford and Eleanor Price, having been granted the opportunity to rebuild their relationship in the context of genuine mutual understanding rather than concealment and shame, found themselves gradually constructing a new family dynamic that acknowledged Eleanor's legitimacy and incorporated her fully into the village community. Thomas made arrangements to provide Eleanor with a modest but sufficient independent income, and Eleanor, freed from the financial desperation that had made her vulnerable to Pritchard's manipulation, was able to focus her considerable artistic talents on her painting, work that began to receive recognition in artistic circles beyond the village. Margaret Whitley, the vicar's wife, found herself substantially deprived of the scandal that had consumed her attention during the investigation's proceedings, and she eventually redirected her formidable energies toward organizing a charity exhibition of Eleanor's paintings, an event that ultimately served to rehabilitate Eleanor's reputation within village society and to transform her from a mysterious outsider into a recognized and respected member of the community. Constance Hartwell, deprived of the opportunity to broadcast scandal, nonetheless found considerable satisfaction in the fact that she had been correct in her observations regarding the suspicious nature of various developments, and she incorporated the entire affair into her repertoire of village history with a gleeful precision that suggested she had derived considerable entertainment from the proceedings. Inspector Walters, reflecting upon the case months after its conclusion, found himself obliged to acknowledge that his initial assessment of the matter as a simple prank had been substantially mistaken. and he developed a profound respect for Miss Marple's capacity to perceive patterns and implications that escaped the notice of more traditionally trained investigators. He made informal arrangements whereby he would, in the future, consult with Miss Marple regarding matters that seemed to involve human motivation rather than merely forensic evidence, recognizing that her decades of observation of village life had provided her with insights that no police academy could provide. Miss Marple herself, having returned to her cottage and to the quiet rhythms of her ordinary life, found herself reflecting upon the matter with the particular satisfaction that comes from having perceived correctly and having acted appropriately in response to that perception. Yet she also found herself contemplating the broader implications of what had occurred, the manner in which vulnerability and desperation could be systematized and exploited by individuals possessed of sufficient calculation and moral flexibility, and the manner in which communities such as Thornfield, for all their apparent simplicity and transparency, contained within them profound depths of hidden complexity and human tragedy. She understood that she had intervened in a situation that might have concluded in considerably greater tragedy than what had actually occurred, and she recognized that the prevention of such tragedy depended upon individuals being willing to perceive patterns of behavior that others overlooked and being courageous enough to act upon those perceptions despite considerable uncertainty regarding outcomes. As autumn progressed into winter, and the village of Thornfield gradually settled into the quieter rhythms of the colder months, Miss Marple found herself resuming her customary activities with the sort of contentment that comes from having engaged in work of genuine consequence and having completed it with a measure of success. The Burano lace cloth, having been examined exhaustively by investigators and having been returned to Mrs. Ashford, was eventually donated to the village church, where it hung in the sacristy as a testament to the complex interplay of human nature that existed beneath the surface of ordinary village life. And Miss Marple, seated in her customary chair with her knitting in her lap, continued her patient observation of the village and its inhabitants, her needles moving in their rhythmic patterns while her mind engaged itself with the endless complexities of human behavior, ready to perceive patterns invisible to others and prepared, should the occasion warrant it, to intervene once more in the affairs of her community with the quiet certainty that came from understanding the profound truth that human nature, in all its varieties and manifestations, revealed itself consistently to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to comprehend what they observed.